Hello everyone, my name is Jess Malcolm and I'm a political reporter with the Australian newspaper. Up here in the Canberra Press Gallery in Parliament House, sounds like you've all had a very interesting day with a lot of amazing speakers. I'm conscious it's around about 4 o'clock, so we're going to need to inject some energy back into the room. So hopefully we could just get started. It's going to be an amazing conversation, I think, about global politics and how all of that is really interacting with agriculture, whether it's inhibiting it or helping it. If we could just start with you, Terry, if you could explain a bit about your background and reflect on some opening remarks.
Sure, thank you. Look, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. My first time to Canberra, and I've loved the weather apart from this morning, which was a little bit cold, but that's not what you come to Australia for. My background, I had 25 years in the New Zealand wine industry before jumping the fence to agriculture, and as Chief Executive of Federated Farmers, a whole brave new world of policy, advocacy, working with governments, and working, of course, with farmers. And at Federated Farmers, our members directly are farmers. We've got 13,000 farms, of which about 9,500 are farm owners. The playing field that we're on, I guess, is that agriculture is so important to New Zealand. It's 82% of all of our merchandisable exports. It took about $56 billion worth of revenue to the year to June, so it's very important to our economy. The challenges that we've got with a small population is that agricultural emissions are huge as a proportion of our climate footprint. And what gets bandied about a lot is that agricultural emissions are 48% of all of our emissions. The challenge we've got is that actually it's only about, just under 20% of warming. So trying to separate out the fact that we have a lot of cows, a lot of ruminants, a lot of methane, that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story about what our climate change footprint looks like. We've had just come out of 6 years of a Labor government. So you are 18 months into a Labor government. We've had some challenges with that as a farming sector. We've had 26 pieces of legislation that affect farmers in the last 6 years. And what that's done more than anything is eroded farmer confidence to the point where farmers don't know how to plan for the future. The huge amount of compliance cost and time has absolutely rocketed up so that farmers spend as much time in front of the computer as they do on the farm. The other challenge we've got as a small country is that on-farm inflation is double that of consumer inflation. So we're sitting at about 15% on-farm inflation at the moment for this year. Of course, that's like I've saw on the slides this morning, costs have gone up hugely, revenue has gone down. A lot of farmers in New Zealand this year won't make any money. A lot of farmers in New Zealand will lose money this year, and yes, it's a cycle and we can weather our way through that. However, it's not all doom and gloom. New Zealand, like Australia, has an amazing climate footprint for the production of nutritious food, and the world needs nutritious food, as we've been hearing all day. And I think that there's collaboratively New Zealand and Australia and other members of the Cairns group, which, thanks to Fiona's leadership from an industry point of view, is trying to drive that trade agenda that's going to make all of our lives, hopefully, a little bit more simple.
And Fiona, you don't need much of an introduction obviously here, but if you could just take a moment to reflect on some opening remarks on how we're faring as a country in terms of policy conditions for farming here in Australia, but also across the globe.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jess, and it's great to be here talking with a slightly different hat on perhaps in terms of my World Farmers organisation role now too. And we've talked a lot this morning about Australian agriculture. I think some of the comments that Terry made are exactly right. The cost of farming is going higher at the moment, and there's a lot of production pressures in Australia. We have a worsening weather situation, but we also have some policies that are really creating a lot of uncertainty in Australia at the moment, and NFF, as everyone knows, has launched a campaign this morning that's aimed at, I think, connecting consumers to the impacts that those policies are going to have on farmers. And that's the important thing, because they're all, the way that we look after our environment, the way that we, look after animals, for example, they're all very topical, important issues that certainly are being driven by a global agenda too at the moment and our customers. But the policies that are being put in place, it's incredibly important that farmers have input into them, because Without that, I think we risk them, and I think farmers at the moment, our survey said, farmers are at the moment really quite nervous that without farmer input into those policies, then we lose opportunities. It's just extra red tape and extra onerous conditions under which we farm. And we want to make the absolute best of our farms. We have an amazing quality product here. We export a lot of it overseas, but over 90% of it is used here in Australia. We are so lucky to have such safe, nutritious food here in Australia, albeit some issues with food waste and all those different things as well. But I think farmers at the moment are feeling under pressure from feeling like they're not actually having enough input into policies that are really going to affect them.
Mm-hmm. And Adam Fennessy, welcome. You're obviously the Department of Agriculture Secretary. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on this from the departmental perspective.
Yep. Thank you, Jess. Good afternoon, everyone. I will, not only am I the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries, Forestry Secretary, I'm the new Secretary, so this is week 6 for me in this role. It's a great opportunity for me to be here. I've already had some very successful engagements and interactions, Fiona, with yourself, with Tony Marr, and I do want to start just by thanking you. You were thanked this morning by many different people, so I'm going to add my thanks to that.
Thank you.
For your considerable leadership. It's great that while you have finished your time at the NFF, you are now going on to lead in the World Farmers organisation. I think I first met DJ, it might have been about 10 years ago, and I reckon it was a pub in Horsham or somewhere like that.
That would be right.
I have worked in agriculture. I was the Secretary for Agriculture in Victoria a number of years ago and did a lot of work. I think you were Vice President of the VFF, DJ, and then you were, of course, Vice President here with the NFF, and now, as of today, or was it yesterday, the President. So I think that's wonderful continuity following your very strong national and global leadership. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for Australian agriculture, DJ, if I may say that, with you coming into the role. You probably had one day to prep up a very big, long, detailed speech. I'm very excited in my new role to be working back in this sector, but at a national level. I've done a lot of work with Ray Smith and others from New Zealand, and I, in my public sector career, including in agriculture, have learnt so many different things from New Zealand. There's an incredible exchange of information, insight, practice, science, a little bit of trade competition, which is a good thing. So that's just a little bit about who I am. I'm very excited to be back in the role. And Jess, to give you a couple of quick comments, from my time at the state government level, and it was Victoria, Australia's agriculture industry has for many, many years and still is world class. There's some things we do incredibly well. There's some things we can learn from others on and improve on. We've always had that commitment to free trade, open trade access, learning from others. We've also had the pride and the history of agriculture and farming across so many different landscapes in Australia. So to me, how do we continue that approach to high quality food and fibre, and work with groups like the National Farmers Federation? And I think Tony Marr was saying the other day, in my first 6 weeks, I've seen Tony about 10 times, and I think that's right. That's how we work. We should work in government, and that's my focus on this, Tony, is how to work alongside. And there are so many things we've been doing together successfully. And as was said this morning, including by Minister Watt, there will be points of difference with government policy. My job at the department is to always be there to put the best policy options and advice to government, work closely with the National Farmers Federation and many other groups and many other people who are in the room, so that we're advocating nationally and internationally. And then I will make a quick point that global food security, that is very high on the policy agenda for all the meetings that I'm involved in. It's a critical opportunity, and even in the last 6 months, we've seen a huge renewed interest, for example, in security issues around the Pacific. That's a huge opportunity. I know New Zealand has really led there, as has Australia. So that's not only a food security issue, but it's also that local in the Asia Pacific and the ASEAN context. How do we build on those relationships that are critical? And that's where there are some global food security challenges as well. So in summary, I'm very excited to be in my role, and I could talk a lot about that, but I will follow the discussion of the panel.
Thanks, Adam. I'm sure we'll cover some of those topics over the next hour. Tom, if you can hear us, if you could tell us a little bit more from the UK perspective.
Good afternoon, Jess, and how I wish I was sitting in that chair next to Adam, because the weather over here in England is pretty miserable at the moment. So, yes, good afternoon to everybody. So we are going through some really intense flooding at the moment, which a lot of our members have got their farms underwater. It started last Thursday, Friday, and unfortunately it's down to a complete lack of maintenance of our watercourses by our Environment Agency. And I guess for me, that's a symptom of the problem, is a lack of understanding of our food systems and how we built these drainage systems hundreds of years ago. But if we don't maintain the very foundations of our food production systems, then we're going to threaten food security, both domestically and internationally. And I think we need politicians to wake up to the serious threat that food security is, and that if we aren't able to maintain this critical national infrastructure, then ultimately we're going to put our food production at risk, and then we'll be demanding food from other parts of the world and creating an imbalance right the way around the world. So it's a very, very serious time for those members whose farm businesses are underwater. But I think it really does make people wake up and think about how we need to prioritise for the future and what the plans need to be. Over here in England, we've been dealing with a number of challenges, and there's none greater than the withdrawal from the EU. And when you have 550 million people living on your doorstep, that's a huge marketplace. And we have just joined the CPTPP, and we've just replaced that 550 million with another 550 million that are situated all around the world. So look, it's great that we've been able to join that trade cooperation agreement, but it does make a mockery of leaving your closest market absolutely on your doorstep, where clearly that's the easiest trade to do, is with those trading partners closest to you. We've then had the COVID debacle here in the UK, which I know everyone around the world has suffered from. But right at the start of COVID, we had empty supermarket shelves. And I think it was the first time in several generations that people hadn't been able to walk into their retailer and pick up whatever they wanted off their shelves. And it was probably the first time that the food system seriously came under threat. But for us, COVID was just a replumbing exercise, because the out-of-home market had shut down overnight. The food was still available, but we had to make it available into the retailers rather than into the markets that it had been going into those food service markets and into the cafes and that out-of-home sector. And then the next crisis to hit was the tragic Ukraine war. And I think that really has shocked markets around the world. And the geopolitical situation today should not be underestimated, with the tragic events now going on in Israel as well. I think that we are living on a knife edge. And anyone who thinks we can take food security for granted, I think really needs to take a long, hard look at what's going on around the world. And then you bring in climate change to the discussion. And Southern Europe was on fire this summer. Record temperatures right the way across Europe. And we as the UK are reliant on importing fruit and vegetables from North Africa and Southern Europe. And when we're bringing in those vegetables, it's not vegetables we're bringing in, it's water from water-depleted areas of the world. And we're putting even more pressure on those parts of the world to produce our food for us. So I think there's a lot of signs there that we need to take responsibility for how we feed 70 million people living on an island. I think for us, for our members, that's a wonderful opportunity to have that size of market on your doorstep. And I remember back in 2011 or 12, when I was doing my Nuffield Scholarship, I had an Australian standing on my doorstep, and he said, mate, you've got 200 million consumers living within 70 miles of you, and what we would give to have that scale of opportunity. So while there's a lot of risks and there's a lot of challenges, which inevitably is going to end up in change, I do think that we here are very well positioned, provided we can take those opportunities. But I think for me, one of the biggest barriers that we've seen is that while we were in the EU, all we ever did was translate policy that was made in the EU, we gold plate it, and we put it in place in the UK. We've had a lot of politicians celebrate the fact that we now have a blank sheet of paper and we can start from scratch. But I think we've seen our civil servants have lost the ability to create policy, because they haven't had to do it for so long that now they're actually, it's become overwhelming, the fact that they can start from this blank sheet of paper. So I think taking responsibility for where we want to get to in 10 years' time, the food policy that we want in place is going to be very important. But the ability to deliver that is actually one of our biggest challenges that we have, because they haven't had to do it for so long. and now it actually becomes sort of overpowering and daunting for them. And then the final thing I just want to reflect on is the empty shelves that we had in February this year. Now, we had our big conference where we have about 1,500 farmers and stakeholders from across the industry. And the morning of our conference, the headlines on the papers were empty supermarket shelves. And these shelves were empty because the retailers had decided that they didn't need UK production from the glass houses through the late winter months. They decided they would put everything on black, and that we would be able to rely on North Africa and Spain to produce that food. And the moment there was a weather issue in those areas of the world, Spain and North Africa decided not to supply the UK market because they could sell it into the European market at a much higher price. And so they decided to short the UK market. And look, I don't blame them, because in a free market economy, they should be able to react in the way the market demands. But the power the retailers have over our supply chains at the moment, and the lack of return for our farming members, is simply not acceptable. And we've got to get to a place where there's a true recognition of the cost of production, and where our members are able to make a return and a living and run profitable businesses. And the word profit should not be a dirty word, because if we want to run sustainable businesses, if we want to farm for the climate for the future, then the most important part of that is to have profit in the first place. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for that, Tom. I just wanted to start off, also we have the Slido app going, so please feel free to add your questions as the conversation goes. We'd be happy to take them, I think, as the panel progresses. I wanted to start with a bit of a political question. Obviously, we've had a change of government in New Zealand and a big, national campaign being launched by the NFF today. So I wanted to know from your different perspectives how you see the policymakers in your countries, or the governments in your countries, rank food and fibre security. Are they ranking it high enough in your opinion? And Terry, could we start with you?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer simply is no, they do not rate it highly enough. I think New Zealand's not alone where policymakers have gone so far down the environmental lens to the detriment of social and economic that everything's slightly out of balance. I think there's a lack of connection, as been talked about already today, about particularly city-based people who tend to run policy, not agricultural people, about where food comes from. Therefore, the tenuous link now between people that design the law and those that are going to be responsible for delivering it or living with it are now completely at odds. So I think, certainly speaking on behalf of New Zealand, we don't have a national food strategy. We should have one. And we should all be on the journey together. And when farmers and growers are being made to feel like they're the problem, not the solution, you've got to bring farmers on the journey with you to actually make meaningful change. And farmers want to make meaningful change, and that's the paradigm here, is that often farmers are conveyed, I'm sure it's the same in Australia to a degree, are made to fit, made to look like they're reactionary and want the status quo, when actually farmers want to do the best for their land. I mean, we've got, at Federated Farmers, we'd have more conservationists in our membership than Greenpeace, but you'd never know that.
I think certainly if I look at Australia, but then I also look globally as well. I mean, I think one of the problems is that when we talk about food security, or when we talk about food systems, sometimes we forget about the fact that that includes the production side of it. And in Australia, particularly at the moment, we're doing environmental reform of a number of different bills, the EPBC Act, for example. We're now starting to talk about nature repair, all those things. But we have to do that with a lens where we can actually include production. And it needs to be, Terry just talked about, did you talk about an Office of Food or a Minister for Food? Earlier today we were talking about, should we have a Minister for Food? But the problem is sometimes I think we think that we can only do one thing at a time. So, during this week I spoke at the Press Club and I talked about the fact that we can't just do one thing at a time anymore. We have to have a healthy environment. Obviously we do. We need to have a healthy environment if we're going to grow healthy food. But we have to have a healthy food system at the same time. We have to have producers who, as Tom said, are actually able to produce food and fibre and also able to turn a buck. So for me, it's a challenge in that Brianna was talking earlier about that for Food Bank, she's got no one minister that looks after her. So in agriculture, even though we have Adam, who I know is going to do a great job in the department and is already kicking the ball, and Murray Watt, who looks after agriculture, in actual fact, we have to also talk to Tanya Plibersek, who looks after water, Chris Bowen, who looks after energy, Madeline King, who looks after infrastructure, the Treasurer, who looks after the money and the taxes and the super funds. All those different ministers are all doing their thing, but all of that, all those policies, which is one of the reasons that the campaign's now been launched, all of those policies are going to have a huge impact on our sector. And so I don't quite know what the answer is to that. I don't think it's necessarily a political colour, to be quite honest. I think it's more about how government works. I think it's about having the machinery of government recognise that food systems need to be robust. And that's not just in Australia, that's globally. At the moment we have food system breakdown right across the world. That's why we're seeing such widespread food insecurity in Australia and everywhere else as well. The problem is really complex. We can't just solve these problems by just one-off policies here and there. We actually have to do it in harmony across a range of departments at the same time with the food system in mind. From the beginning of the food system, which is where the producers lie, all the way through. And until we actually get serious about that, then I think we're really up against it when it comes to things that are disrupting the food system, like, they call it the 3 Cs, COVID, climate, conflict at the moment. And, you heard Tom talking about all the different, things that are disrupting the UK's. We're having things disrupting the Australian food systems too, massively. And we're going to have more of that as the climate changes more. So I think we do need to get serious about food systems. We need to get serious about food system reform. We need to get serious about how we do it in Australia, obviously, because this is our patch, but globally it's a massive issue that we have to be part of that problem as well.
Yeah, look, my comments are quite consistent, or very consistent, Fiona, with yours, and in fact you and I and some people in this room, and including Tony Ma, were at a Australian Farm Institute roundtable I think 2 weeks ago, and discussion moved quickly to systems. It is about systems, it's about the whole supply chain. And then Tom Bradshaw, I really appreciated your insight that when COVID hit, we realised how fragile our supply chains are, and particularly the very globalised ones. And Australia is a very urban country. Most of our population live on the coast and in big cities. And people will forget very quickly, and then it gets generational, where all that food on the supermarket shelf comes from. And when it's turned off by COVID or conflict or the longer term changes that climate brings to that, it is a reminder. And then we heard all sorts of new phrases which bureaucrats love, like onshoring and friendshoring and localised. There's good sense behind those too. We worked out what our supply chains look like and how vulnerable they were. So food security didn't become something for other parts of the world, it was here as well, supply security. One thing, Australia's very coastal and a lot of big cities, and big cities are wonderful. I spent 10 years living in regional Victoria when I was a senior public servant. I think I was the first Victorian secretary not to be living in Melbourne for a long time. I lived in Bendigo, and that was great because even though Bendigo is also a big regional city, I got a lot more instant feedback on what was going on around that part of central Victoria. That was very valuable to me because as a public servant, I'm here for the public, and the risk of forgetting what's happening across the huge continent of Australia, let alone into our region, is ever present, and that's a big challenge in Canberra. So this is a very much a Canberra type thing to say, but in my first 6 weeks, there's 16 secretaries or heads of Commonwealth departments here, and I've met 10 already. I've met David Fredericks, who's the Secretary of Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water. I've met him 3 times now, including a very good detailed catch up yesterday, because the public service needs to be beating a path around Canberra. I had a really good discussion with Megan Quinn, who's the industry secretary responsible for food policy from an industry perspective, and then finance so we can get the money, treasury so we can make the economic case. So in one respect, my job, and Minister Murray Watt was very clear to me day one, get out there, be very noisy from a public service perspective, and I think he also said, make sure you speak to Fiona and Tony, and now we can put in there DJ, because if we're not doing that, there is that risk that agriculture will be taken for granted, and I think that may have happened. I can't comment over the ditch, but it likely happened in New Zealand. And again, Tom, your reminder that officials in the UK possibly put their pens away 10, 15 years ago on United Kingdom agriculture policy because it was EU ag policy. It's an interesting point that even though I lived in Victoria for most of my life, I now live in Brisbane, so apologies to Victorians and cheers to Georgie, Somerset and Queenslanders, that the other day, because of the UK free trade agreement with Australia, the silver lining is that's a huge opportunity for Australia, and we had our first sugar shipment from Queensland off to the UK not that long ago, as in only a few months ago. So even though there are challenges that we are constantly facing, there's opportunities as well. So that's why those international relationships are both bilateral and multilateral. But I think in conclusion, for that kind of role of agriculture and the Agriculture Department in Australia, we've got to be always fiercely looking outwards and getting in everyone's faces about the importance of what we do across agriculture.
Right. And Tom, how is it ranking in the UK from your perspective?
Well, I was hoping we were going to get through this session without talking about free trade, but Adam decided to bring it up there.
Sorry.
You mentioned it.
I mentioned it. That's because we sent some sugar your way.
And look, seeing the celebration from Australia when the trade deal was signed tells you who got the best part of that deal. And look, we are a little bit bitter about it, but I know the bitterness goes back about 60 years as well. So on the other side, so look, we understand exactly where we are. From an NFU perspective, we've always stood for fair trade, not free trade. And we think the two are actually very different, because we do want core standards of production that so that our farmers are competing on a level playing field and not with their hands tied behind their back. And I think that for us is the biggest challenge that we see, is that making sure that we're not bringing in imports that have been produced in a way that we wouldn't produce here. What I'm not going to tell you is that your systems of production aren't safe, because they absolutely are. And maybe we would like access to some of the tools that you have access to, but at the moment we don't. And that does give you a competitive advantage, and that's why we've fought this so hard. Is because if we're not going to have that competitive advantage and use those tools and those systems in the UK, then that puts our members at a disadvantage. But on food security, what I wanted to reflect on there is that in the UK we have the third cheapest food in the world, and arguably food is too cheap. It's not valued for what it delivers, and unfortunately, it's become a source of illness rather than a source of health, in the way that we're eating the food and the food that we're eating. And as farmers, to think that the raw ingredients we're producing are being turned into something which could be making people ill rather than making people healthy is a really poor indictment on our food system. And we've lost control of that food system as farmers, but we're still producing those raw ingredients. And those raw ingredients, if you look at red meat, absolutely essential part of a healthy diet. But then if you look at the ultra-processed plant-based alternatives that have got 20 or 30 ingredients going into them, how have we got into a place where something that's ultra-processed is being sold as more healthy than the natural ingredient which is being produced on that farm? And I think that the source of this ultimately is the fact that food is no longer valued. Very often it's invisible. People don't really understand what it is that they're eating. But if we're going to have a grown-up conversation about sustainability, about all of the challenges we need to face, thinking particularly around animal health and welfare, then part of that has to be about the value of food, and how as society we get back to a place where maybe we recognize that more of our disposable income has to be spent on that food rather than looking for the lowest cost denominator. Because I think the longer we continue in this race to the bottom, the more difficult it's going to be to mend our broken food systems and make sure that sustainability really is at the heart of them, because there simply there isn't that money to reinvest in those food systems. And one example I'll give you here from England is we've got this commitment that retailers were looking at called the Better Chicken Commitment. Now, we already have some of the highest production systems in the world for broiler meat production. We're at 38 kilograms maximum per square meter, whereas the EU is at 42. But there was this thought that the consumer wanted a higher welfare, slower growing bird. And now that higher welfare, slower growing bird has a 20% higher carbon footprint and 21% higher water usage. And actually, in a time of the huge challenge of the cost of living crisis, the consumer doesn't want to buy that higher priced bird. And so there's a lot of pressure being put onto our farmers to produce this slower growing, higher welfare bird. But it's not been a market demand which has been responded to, particularly in times of economic trouble. And working out what the consumer really wants is absolutely essential to thinking to how we solve this food security issue, because I think there are really mixed messages, and it's you can't have everything. But I think as farmers, we need to understand what it is that consumers want to buy and where they're going to be willing to spend their pound.
Great, thanks, Tom. I'd love to pick up on a question from the audience that we have here. Peter Thomas has asked, are there any innovative suggestions beyond what's already happening in agriculture as to how we can connect and reconnect people to where and why and how their food is grown and comes from? And I guess broader than that, something that we've just touched on earlier is how do we kind of get, if we're going to have the policymakers making the policy and settings done in the cities, and there's obviously going to be a disconnect to those out in the regions, that might be, a perennial problem into the future. So how do we tackle that?
I'll start off because I don't think it happens overnight. I mean, in Australia, we've been now at NFF spending real-time resources, efforts, dollars in doing it, and our members over the last, say, decade. And we're starting to see results, and we're actually starting to be able to target and see where we particularly need to be putting that message, where it's making the most. We're working now, I'm delighted to say, as a whole industry in terms of education, in making sure that kids in schools can learn about where their food and fibre comes from. There was a whole, I would say, decade where kids weren't doing that. We'd sort of forgotten about, as an industry, we'd sort of kept just doing our own thing on our farms and not really thinking about, the curriculums and schools and having input into those things. So I think in Australia we're starting to see the fruits of some of that now come through with the changes in our industry, the statistics that are saying there's a lot more young people now in our industry, a lot more women in our industry, we're much more ethnically diverse than we've ever been before. But I think we have to, you can't just set and forget. You have to keep trying anything innovative. We've got telling our story programs where we enable farmers to tell their stories from their own farms, with, just literally lining up the video. We've got National Agriculture Day coming up on the 17th of November, where again, it's a day to reflect, celebrate, put out stories about what we do. We've got campaign, Ag Career Start, where we put gap year kids in, very popular, another 100 kids going out on farms in a concierge program this year. So lots and lots of different things. In terms of innovative, I reckon I noticed a question up there about the Tom Diddley Squat, the Tom Clarkson farm in England, which I actually have seen, Tom. And I've seen the queues of people waiting to get in, and I've seen the queues of people waiting for their litre of milk and parked in the laneway because he wouldn't build a car park. I'd love to see if there were some figures on that, because I think we've just got to try anything and everything in terms of, letting people know where their food comes from and connecting them to farmers and food.
And Terry, what about kids in New Zealand? Do they know where their food's coming from?
Less and less, unfortunately. But what some of the innovations that have happened are probably twofold. One, there was a pilot tried a few years ago about incorporating agriculture into right across the school curriculum as the exemplars or the examples. So, for example, in a year 11 or year 12 statistics course, using sheep genetics as the database or the data set for statistics learning, opening kids' eyes to, I'd never really thought about agriculture before, and then maybe stimulate some ideas around how the whole food system works. And that's just one little example. Trying to get teachers to take those things. So I used to be chief executive of New Zealand Young Farmers, and this was the initiative that we had. I end up having to employ school teachers to talk to teachers to use these resources because teachers only trust other teachers. So it's a long, heavy investment issue that end up just running out of money, unfortunately. I still think it was a real winner. The second thing that New Zealand's done, I'm sure there's programs in Australia, where farmers just open up their gates and invite urban people to actually can spend a day on a farm. And Fonterra, who's our largest dairy producer, run a program every year, and a lot of their farmers will participate in this, and they're always oversubscribed. So there's definitely an interest by people. It's the mechanism to get there. The problem, I guess, in Australia and to a lesser extent New Zealand is that farms are quite a long way from where urban people live. And how do you facilitate that journey? And New Zealand's not quite so bad. There's farms generally within 15 to 20 minutes, 30 minutes maybe from urban centres. So it's just trying to get those people out and experiencing it.
If I could add an example, and then in the post-COVID parlance, I can see Tom's got his hand up as well on his screen. But Tom, if you don't mind me jumping in, this is an allied example in my own family. So when I got my new job, I was trying to explain to my 3 daughters what it was, and they weren't that interested. But then thinking about biosecurity, they love watching border security. And I said, oh, those dogs, that's part of biosecurity. And they didn't really know what biosecurity meant, but they love the dogs. And they said, oh, they're the dogs, Dad. So then they said, that's a really good job. So that's, and biosecurity is very difficult to explain to a lot of different people. Other than, we want to keep your food safe. And people say, yeah, that's your job. But to get say $1 billion investment from, where taxpayers will contribute to that, to get that story is very difficult. So telling our story, whether it be about food, fibre, the role of farmers in agriculture, or in this case, biosecurity, is really important. And the Tom Clarkson example shows, let's use every lever possible. And this is where I think the NFF and other groups have done really good work. And then how do we learn? Because that was your original question. Who does this well around the globe? How do we do that? And in some cases, we might do it well. How do we keep improving on that? But at the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries, Forestry, we have little soft, fluffy toys that are Labradors with biosecurity on them. So on my first day, I ordered a few from the team, which I gave to my daughters, and they're really happy. And now they actually know a little bit about biosecurity.
That's great. Tom, do you have any ideas for us over in the UK that we could learn from?
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely one of the areas where we can and should collaborate, because trying to make sure that the world population understands where their food comes from is absolutely essential. We do run an education program in the NFU, and 5 years ago, if somebody had said they wanted rural education, they wouldn't have come anywhere near the NFU. It would highly have likely been an environmental NGO that was giving the lesson. But just 2 weeks ago, our education team were actually behind the door in number 10 in Parliament. So that's the most famous door in the country, one of the most famous doors in the world. And the Prime Minister's wife, Akshata Murthy, hosts these things called Lessons at 10. And she welcomed in our education team to give a lesson about farming, which was just quite incredible. There's also something called Farmer Time, where there's a charity called Leaf that have partnered with Farmer Time, and they give live lessons to classes once a fortnight for half an hour, just talking about what's going on the farm. And actually, the biggest barrier we've got there is getting farmers to sign up to take part. We are inundated with schools that want to do it, but provided you've got rural broadband, which I know is often a challenge, but if you have got rural broadband, then you can do that from anywhere in the country and sort of zoom into the lesson and give them an update on what's going on the farm. We do host Open Farm Sunday, which again is a really good success, and that works very well. But then you've got the celebrities, and we've been lucky that we've had the support of quite a few celebrity chefs. Jamie Oliver would be one of them who's been very supportive, and then Clarkson's Farm, and you can't underestimate the impact Clarkson's Farm has had. It's a bit of a double-edged sword because there's things going on Clarkson's Farm that we can't ever condone. Some of the health and safety issues that we see, they do drive members get very concerned about the issues. And then you can imagine the TikTok videos are doing the rounds of people who are copying what they saw on Clarkson's Farm. But he's reached an audience we could only ever dream of. And so, recognizing that they will only be doing it for themselves and they're not doing it for the industry, but he has got a huge, huge following. And we've got civil servants that think they know about farming because of Clarkson's farm. And well, yeah, one of the bigger barriers we see, on a sort of serious note, is that a lot of people that go into the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs have done environmental science, and they have absolutely no understanding of agriculture whatsoever. And if they just have a little snippet because they've watched Clarkson's farm, well, that's better than having no understanding whatsoever. And so he has been a force for good without a shadow of a doubt. And he's reached that much wider audience, which I guess we all have to try and understand how we can access that audience.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I guess it's things like TikTok and Instagram and how those kind of ideas can really spread so quickly on social media. It really shows the power of it. I'd love to turn the conversation now to activism and whether you think, the rise of kind of climate activism in metropolitan areas is shaping the way that people think about farming and farming practices. Terry, would you like to start?
Yeah, and look, there's definitely a time and a place for any kind of activism. So that's part of a proper society. So I've got no issue with that. The problems that I have is when you're looking at it with only one particular lens, with no regard for a balanced view, that then becomes the narrative for a whole chunk of people in society. And again, so it's not downplaying the importance of an environmental viewpoint, but if you only have the environmental viewpoint, so one of the things in New Zealand is, there's been a big call from the environmental movement to halve our cow numbers. So that's fine if you're quite prepared to forego half of $20 billion worth of dairy exports. What do you replace that money with? And you can't replace it overnight, as any economy will know. But there's no regard for that. There's no regard for what will that do to rural New Zealand when the production stops, all of the allied services stop, the population starts to drift away because there's no work, there's local school closes. When have you ever heard a headline that says a rural school has reopened? Once a school is gone, it is gone. I'm sure that's global. And so whilst on the outside you can see the viewpoint of what they're trying to achieve, but it's so narrow-minded and so incomplete that it actually destroys their own argument.
I totally agree with Terry, and you could swap any industry in Australia out for your dairy industry, it would be the same. But I think the other thing about, and look, I agree too, there's a role for activism, and sometimes you need massive change, cultural change, you need activists to do that and challenge established ideas that might be wrong. And I've had my own little go at activism in the Liverpool Plains when I was protesting against coal mines on the plains. So I believe there is a role for activism, but I also think sometimes though what happens is that the loudest voice, people think that the loudest voice is the right voice, and the loudest voice is the voice of truth, and the loudest voice is the voice of the community, and that's what the community believes. And just yesterday at National Farmers, at our Members' Council meeting, one of the AgriFutures, which is one of our rural research and development corporations that collects levies from farmers, matches it with levies from government for research, it was telling us about its research into community trust. And at the moment, the research that we've done and others have done into farmer sentiment says that farmers mostly feel undervalued. A huge percentage of farmers feel that they're not being valued by the community. Now, our own little piece of research that NFF has done alongside our Telling Our Story surveys, for example, has said that that's not the case at all. That certainly there's a lot of people in the cities now who don't know much about farmers, but they really, and they don't know what we do, but they value us. Like, we're really highly valued up there at the top. And AgriFutures was telling us that their figures over 4 years was 91%. So 91% of their 6,000 people that they survey value farmers and what they do very highly. So I guess if you've got activists out there, though, loudly saying, cows are bad, farmers are bad, all these things are bad, and we have to have one eye and there's only one way of treating it, that risks becoming the dialogue of so many people. People read it, they think it's the truth. Decision makers, bureaucrats read it and think it's what the community's thinking. And that's where I think we have to have this balance. We have to have a balanced dialogue. We have to have policymakers who are aware of the need for balance in the policy settings. We need to make sure that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, where we can actually think in a balanced way. And we have to be careful of the role of social media in all these things, because nowadays people just read often they have one tribe, they have one set of paper, one paper that they read, they have the same sort of Facebook friends that just keep telling them the same thing, and things become truth. So I think, yes, there's a role for activism, but let's be careful. Let's make sure we keep, being open to things, open to learning the truth, putting facts and balanced, credible data out there, and making sure that we can look at the whole picture.
Adam, how does the department kind of reflect on this or navigate this?
Yeah, so I think that the big challenge is the competing voices and the loudest voices, which will often attract attention. I think Tom put it really well before, thinking about it from the UK perspective. Firstly, how do we work out what the consumer really wants? Now, the consumer voice is very disparate, but that drives a lot of the value, the food system production, and so on. So how are we getting ahead of the shrill voices that often don't speak for the consumer or care about what the consumer wants? So firstly, how do we work together and be active rather than activists in the other sense? The telling our story to me is a great opportunity, but social media is it's like wildfire. So how do we get savvy and better at that? I've seen, because I've got children, they love Instagram, and there's some great things on Instagram from young, passionate farmers showing fantastic stories. So how do you get in and amongst it? And always bring it back to, being from the public service, you'll expect me to say some evidence, and then evidence is really important to balance and counterbalance activist campaigns, which are often not particularly evidence-based. And the final point I'll say, and this is like a prop that I've used for the last couple of weeks, this is a really good piece of work by the NFF that I'll hold up, and you soft launched it, or maybe hard launched it last week, Fiona, with Tony Marr, Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework. To me, in things like climate change, there's a lot of very noisy voices. This is a good evidence-based piece of work that the NFF led, funded by the department, and it brings that whole story in. So how are we telling that story? This is very evidence-based, but also a lot of fast-moving debate doesn't care about the evidence. So it's using everything we've got. And why I think that's a really good example is that's a partnership. That the NFF led that, we put funding into it, there's other partners involved. I saw Tony share that up at Rockhampton at the Drought Forum when we were up there a few weeks ago. Then you shared it again in Canberra last week. So how are we telling that story around Australia? How are we also telling that story internationally so that people know we care in Australia? And how we're then sharing our insights, for example, with New Zealand or the UK. So it's telling the story, but acknowledging that these things can move really fast, and therefore we've got to get good at that too. And I say we, as how does the department work with the NFF and other partners, where we will have some differences from time to time. It's the things we do together that are so important, so let's focus on that. And I love that as an example. So to me, I've already said to Tony and DJ, just as I said to Fiona the other day, how are we doing more of that from a departmental perspective? Because that is supporting Australian agriculture, which is our core responsibility.
And Tom, over in the UK, is it the loudest voices shaping the kind of conversation over the minority? If you could have some reflections on that.
I mean, it definitely is, Jess. I think one of the challenges we see is that it does feel like we're living in the post-truth world. And that's been led by some of the world-leading politicians. That they've been able to say anything and get away with anything. And if we are genuinely in a world where populism drives everything, then we're not going to get the right outcomes. So I mean that is a major concern that I have. We want a science and evidence-based policy. As farmers, we know that we're only custodians of this land that we're lucky enough to farm for our generations. And we know we want to hand that farm on in a better condition or as good a condition as we inherited it. And they have to be our core principles. Otherwise, we're in a downward spiral. And so I think it was Terry who said at the start, that New Zealand Federated Farmers is made up of environmentalists. And farmers are your traditional environmentalists that are at the heart of these communities, that are at the heart of looking after the land. But trying to get that message across is actually very, very difficult, particularly when you're dealing with single issue lobby groups. And when I look at the way that this debate is shaping at the moment, and I'll particularly pick on methane and ruminants, the ruminant cycle, the methane cycle is just part of the natural cycle. Now, we know if you removed all ruminants from the planet today, for 14 years, the planet would cool. But after that, it would no longer cool, it would stop cooling. And that doesn't solve the world's problems. But if people are told that by changing their diet, they're going to solve climate change, and then we get 30 years down the road and people have changed their diet, but we haven't solved climate change, that's not a solution. That's just a sop to make people feel good about continuing flying, continuing driving their cars, continuing having an exploitative relationship with the world. And we've got to get this right. And at the moment, I think politicians are looking for easy answers. And unfortunately, the 5-year political cycle that we live in leads to looking for easy answers when something as serious as climate change needs depoliticizing. Now, it's easy for me to say that. It's very difficult to deliver it. But actually, joint party politics on something like climate change is what we should be looking to deliver to try and depoliticize it and actually have a long-term plan for how we're going to deal with it.
Thanks, Tom. We're all out of time, so if you can join me in thanking this panel, Terry, Fiona, Adam and Tom. It's been a wonderful conversation.